All right, on today's show, we get to hear from New York Times sports journalist and best-selling author Christopher Clarey. He has more than 30 years of covering global sports, including 14 Olympics, 6 World Cups, and more than 100 Grand Slam tennis tournaments. Although he is one of the world's leading authorities on tennis, he is truly an expert in many different sports. Listen in to today's episode, where you'll get to hear stories about the high-profile athletes he has met and gotten to know very well, like Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal, both athletes whom he has written biographies on, with Nadal's to be released in 2025. All right. Well, today we are here with Christopher Clarey. He is or has been a sports journalist for the New York Times, and he's an author. He's covered 14 Olympics, 6 World Cups, and over 100 Grand Slam tennis tournaments. So he is a big dog, and he's in-house with us today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, Megan, great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so let's start with kind of what's more first and foremost and most recent. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your new venture, Tennis and Beyond, and what's that about and how did that come to be?
You know, it's interesting because I was for more than 30 years, almost 40 years, I worked daily journalism, for newspapers, which became websites for the New York Times. And then there was a publication called the International Herald Tribune, which was sort of the international version of the New York Times. And that was a great gig because it was global sports. There were no locals. It was everybody in the world he wanted to write about. And I covered, global sports through them as a New York Times property and then the New York Times itself for a long time. But when I decided to leave and become a full-time author, I knew I'd still want to have that outlet to write shorter form and to be able to, I think, have more of a regular contact with an audience, which I was used to, both in a critical way and a supportive way, hopefully. And there's this platform called Substack now, which I'm sure many people that you listening will probably know about, but I didn't know much about it before when I left, and I really looked into it, and I realized people that had an expertise, and my expertise really is tennis and Olympics, really, but I thought it would be a good place for me to be able to fulfill that need for instant gratification or instant criticism and go on Substack and create a community there. And I wanted to keep my tennis community together. So I started this thing called Tennis and Beyond, and I'm writing regularly for it. And it's, partially subscription, partially open access. And it's been great. I've been doing it. I had to shut it down for a few months when I was doing my manuscript for the book I'm working on about Rafael Nadal. But I basically have had it up and going maybe for about 6 or 7 months now. And we've got, several thousand subscribers, and we've got people from 101 countries. I keep track of all this for you. 101 countries and 48 states. So I think I'm missing Alabama and Alaska. If anybody's listening, please, join in. We'd like to fill the 50.
That's right. Well, clearly you've had, a great career and it's been your passion, and it's really cool that you've been able to find a new outlet for your passion of sharing these stories. And so I know you mentioned you're coming out with a new book on Nadal. And before we learn a little bit more about that, I want to talk about your current book. So I know you've added a new chapter about Roger Federer. So could you share a little bit about why that was necessary and maybe some insights that you've learned on him? I know that you've probably gotten to know a lot about him and his story.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, I wrote a book called The Master, which was first published in 2021. And I was very fortunate. The timing of it was really good. And Roger's a beloved character around the world in a lot of places. So it actually ended up becoming a New York Times bestseller. And it became a bestseller in a bunch of countries, really driven by the interests as Roger was coming to the end of his career. But he wasn't quite finished. It came out, it's hard to time these things because I think you really want to try to publish a book like that, a biography, when the interest is at its peak. And honestly, when people, once they retire, the interest drops off a bit. And also, I think I just felt that at some point, a guy like Federer, much like a Tom Brady or whoever it might be, is going to have a desire to do their own book at some point and their own documentation of their career. And so I wanted to kind of catch it a little before that. And I'd been around Roger a lot over 20 years. So I put the book out in 2021 when he wasn't quite finished, figuring that his main body of work was done. And then book did really well. And so often you don't get a chance to go back and do more with it. But because of the success of it, the publisher said, well, once he retires for real, you should think about, finishing it up and putting an extra chapter or two on there to kind of complete the story. So when he really retired officially, which was in 22, and he came back and played one more tournament. I decided that it would be good to, and it was a very emotional thing when he came back. He came back after having not played for almost a year, and he came back in London at a team event that he had basically created. And it had all his rivals. Like if you follow tennis, Novak Djokovic, and of course, Rafael Nadal and Andy Murray were all there with him on the European team in this thing that he created. And it just was an extremely emotional moment. Roger's an emotional person, unusually, I think, accessible with his emotions for honestly, for a male athlete. Kind of broke the mold in that way, and I think pushed the boundaries in a very good way on that. But he's a crier, as he would describe himself. So lots of tears in this thing, and it was kind of like it felt more like a farewell concert than it did like a farewell tennis match. Nobody really probably could even tell you who won or lost the match. It was more about the moment of Roger saying goodbye, and it had it's a lot of resonance and power. So I based the last chapter of this new version of the book. Everything else is the same, really. I dove back into South Africa, where he's from. I had a chapter from traveling down there when he played an exhibition against Nadal, which broke the record for the most people to watch a tennis match in history, 50,000 people in a soccer stadium watching them play. So I expanded that chapter, and then I added the final one about his goodbye. And as it turns out, he's actually releasing a documentary, I think later this year, based around this last match in London. So I think if you read the book and then you watch the documentary, it'd be a nice double. But it finishes up his playing career. And I think if I hadn't done that, I would have regretted not having that full circle, knowing that it happened.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think it was.
Everyone wants an ending to the story, and I'm sure it would have felt so incomplete without you going to circle back and add a good end to the story. And I mean, he made a big comeback after his surgery. So was coming back to play for him kind of about, like, was he trying to prove something else to himself, and maybe he felt like he still had some more in the tank? Because that was a pretty big surgery and, comeback story.
No, it's a good point, Megan. And I don't know how you finished your career as a pole vaulter, but I know that every athlete, I think, has to face it at an elite level. And how do you want to say goodbye? How do you do it? It's a little different for an individual sport athlete like a tennis player than it is for a team athlete, somebody on a NFL team or somebody who's, part of a soccer team. Eventually, your coach is probably going to tell you when it's over, right? And if not that coach, another coach will tell you. But as an individual athlete, if somebody's of the stature of Federer, you can kind of pick your spot when you're ready to say goodbye. Even though maybe your ranking isn't as high, you're still going to get into these tournaments because of who you are. So it's kind of up to you to decide how you want to do it. And ultimately, I think Roger would have played into probably his 50s if his body would have allowed him. He just loved it so much. Kind of like, Tom Brady played into mid 40s. You see guys like Jaromir Jagr, the NHL player. You see some of these soccer players like Ronaldo. These guys are going to play deep as they can because they have the passion, and honestly, too, it's an amazing business. They're able to really keep this brand going and sustain it. But Roger, I think, really loves the act and process of playing tennis. And his knees, ultimately, he had a pretty injury-free career for an elite athlete for a long time. But at the end, it really caught up with him with his knees. And I think he just ultimately, as you could see in London in this last match that he played, he really couldn't run much anymore.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and he hasn't played exhibitions really since. So you can tell you that he's obviously not really, he's definitely paid a price for all those miles on the body. But I think, he wanted to come back and really feel like, as he says, squeeze the lemon, all the juice out of the lemon. And I think at the end, he was very much at peace. I wrote about that in the last chapter. I think he said that. He said, I felt like I squeezed everything I could out of it, and I'm at peace now, and I don't think I have any more to give. And I wish that my guys who followed me, the Nadals and Djokovic's, will have that same opportunity to feel the same way. And I believe him. I think he did give it all he had, and I think he could sense that last match that, the balls that were once easy to get to were no longer so easy.
Yeah, and no athlete wants to end their career with, a future doubt or, something in their mind saying, man, I wish I could have done this or could have done that. But at least he has that peace of mind that he really gave it everything he could for as long as he could. And I think that is so impressive. And now I want to switch gears because you have kind of alluded to Nadal here. And so Federer and Nadal, clearly they are just different personalities, different players. You've spent some good time with both, and now you're writing a book on Nadal. Could you maybe share some things that struck you as far as how they are similar or how they are different?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know how much people in your audience followed their rivalry closely over the years. It's a very big global rivalry. one of the best, I think, in the history of sports, period, not just tennis. People often forget, though, I mean, Roger's 5 years older than Rafa, and which is a lot in an individual sport like tennis. It's his longevity and his ability to stay healthy really allowed them to be on more equal terms. But ultimately, Rafa is 5 years younger. And so there was definitely, I think that changed the dynamic of it a little bit. Rafa didn't grow up admiring and venerating Roger. He was such a prodigy that he came along in his teens. And when Roger was just starting to get great, Rafa was starting to get pretty great too. So in that sense, it was more of an equal thing. But I guess the funny thing is that they play very differently. Rafa's a left-hander, very emotive, explosive, kind of rough-hewn sort of player, slashing style, lots of leaping and heavy topspin and grunting and all that, and sweating. And Roger has always made tennis look incredibly easy, even though it's such a hard game, and even though the things that he does with the racket are really difficult. It's so smooth and elegant. He's a righty. He hits a one-handed backhand. Rafa hits a two-handed backhand. He's got a mask on, one that he acquired over time. He's somebody who is by nature quite volcanic, I think, but he's somebody who had to learn to suppress that to play his best tennis in order to control his emotions. So they're very different in a way, visually. But the more I studied them for the book that I did on Roger, and then the book I'm doing now on Nadal, which is more focused really on Rafa's amazing record on the surface of clay and on the Roland Garros French Open results, where he's won 14 times, which is just crazy for one tournament. But I think what I discovered was they have a lot in common. And at the beginning, when I first met them at different times in their careers, obviously Rafa didn't speak a lot of English and Roger doesn't speak any Spanish. So a lot of their connection was happening on a kind of an intuitive level. And it was hard for Roger because Rafa was coming on as this prodigy, taking some of his air and space, beating him. He beat him in their first match ever in Miami when Rafa was just arriving on the scene. So Roger always knew that Rafa was a danger. But I think he had to really learn to accept the fact that there was this guy who did it a different way, but was every bit as talented and good as he was in some respects. And ultimately, at the beginning, no matter how people look at the rivalry now as this friendly, collegial thing, it was hard for Roger. I think he resented it. Like, I just got to the top, and here's this guy arriving to challenge me. And it took a long time, but I think they really came to a very special place. And I've seen a lot of rivalries in sports, in many different sports. And I think what's really cool about it, I guess, in a way, I could relate it to some of the things that you would know a lot because of your experience. I've watched decathletes and heptathletes in track and field, and that sense of they are competing with each other, but they're also competing against themselves. But there's a wonderful spirit in that group when they compete for medals. And ultimately, Roger and Rafa got to sort of the same place in an individual head-to-head sport where they really respected the other person. And I think they really also realized that they had these great matches, but these great matches were actually bigger than the two of them. The matches were great for their sport, great for sports in general, and I think they really took pride ultimately in how they projected their rivalry and the kind of the classiness with which they went about it, and the lessons that they could project through that. And let's be honest here, the merchandise they could move from the fact that their rivalry was such a popular and special thing. So I think it all kind of came together in a unique way, and there have been lots of rivalries in tennis, but what also separates this one, besides the fact that it's so collegial, I think, is the fact that it lasted so long. And they played each other, off and on for close to 15 years at a high level. And that's a long time to be in the public eye in a sport like tennis.
Yeah, and that is just really cool that you've had almost such a front seat to be able to witness it and learn so much about their stories along the way. And that's just the crazy thing about sports is there's always someone that's coming up that's going to just challenge you and just keep pushing you to become better. And I think that's some of the beauty in sports. And now you've had so much experience with interviewing and following the Olympic Games and World Championships. What other sports have you enjoyed covering? Because tennis, you've made a really big name for yourself, but are there any other sports that you've enjoyed working with?
It's funny. I started covering sports actually in high school in Coronado, San Diego, California, which is where I'm from. And then I played sports at a Division III level myself when I was in college, and played tennis and volleyball and soccer. And then when I got out into the working world and I became a journalist, people always said, so, why did you stay in sports so long? You could have gone other different directions. I ended up working for the New York Times, which obviously is a great privilege and a real responsibility. But I was really ultimately very happy in sports. And I think it's because I found that everything that you could look for as a journalist, as a human, really, you can find in the sports world in one way or another. There's everything from, the human interest to the global aspect of it, to the scientific side of it, to the techie side of it, to travel. It was all kind of blended in that global sports world. And I honestly, it just never basically stopped grabbing me all the way through. And the other thing that I really liked about it, and I realized this kind of late in the game, I realized that a lot of the sports that I gravitated to covering, um, I love winter sport, alpine skiing, figure skating, Nordic skiing, love track and field, always have. Thought that was incredibly cool that all these disciplines could come together and the same, especially the one night meets like Zurich or Brussels, these things where you have like a 12 ring circus going on at the same time on a meet. And I love that. And I love soccer and love sailing, covered a lot of sailing over the years, covered America's Cups in yachting, covered offshore racing, Olympic sailing. And I realized over time, what was the kind of the common thread here? And the interesting thing was they were all women's and men's sports. And they often competed together, not against each other, but in the same venues. And I realized that was something that from an early age, I have three children, 2 daughters and a non-binary child. And I have, my mother and I are very close. And I really connected it without even really realizing over time to sports when there was that balance. And I think that's what's kept me in tennis too over the years, that the fact that women and men they kind of alternate as the main story. And so I think that really kept me in these certain sports. Alpine skiing, similar. I mean, look at someone like Lindsey Vonn or Michaela Schifrin. We've had bigger skiers who are women, who are stars in our country in the last 10, 15 years. Wasn't always the case, but the last 10, 15 years have been the women, not the men. And in tennis, Serena Williams, Venus Williams, people like that, Steffi Graf over the years. I like things, I think, instinctively where there was that balance between the two. And I think a lot of those global sports, individual or the team sports, and soccer is obviously changing. Women's soccer is booming now around the world, and it's great to see. Women's basketball as well. So I think we're coming to a really cool place, but I feel like no way am I bragging, but just my own instincts. I feel like I was a little bit ahead of the curve there and what drew me in and what I liked. And I think it made it so much more interesting to cover that when you had both the women's perspective and the men's perspective on these different sports.
Yeah, and thanks so much for sharing that. And that kind of brings me back to what we're about at Sport Feels Life. We want to share that message and inspire others, because we really do believe that sports make such an impact in the world. And so it's really cool that you've gotten to travel the world, and it's cool to see that sports really unites people among their differences. And even from the individual sport versus the team sport, I'd be curious to hear maybe some of your favorite stories with individual sports, because that seems to be an area that you focused on a lot, but it's such a different mentality. And I guess, yeah, what are some stories that stand out to you as far as just maybe they're funny, or just maybe some of the most inspiring ones that come to mind?
Yeah, it's always hard to pull them out of the clear blue sky like that because there's so many over the years. I guess, ultimately, I think you just look at these athletes and what they have to overcome a lot of times. I think that's what sticks with you too, and sort of what they're able to come out of and emerge from and use for fuel. And to use your guys' theme for your podcast and your publication, I mean, sport's a fuel for life, but also sport can be a fuel for all kinds of things. And I look at Novak Djokovic, for example, is a good example of somebody. I haven't read a book about him yet. Hopefully someday I will, but sure, I've covered him a lot. And he's somebody who is a controversial character, I would say, in some ways, because of his stance on vaccines and because of some of the ways I think he broke up the Rafael Nadal, Roger Federer rivalry in fans' minds. It made it hard to accept him on the same level. But Novak basically came from a situation with Serbia and ex-Yugoslavia where, he's in the middle of NATO bombing. He was growing up in a time when tennis was not something that was easily accessible to his family or in his country because of the timing of it. And I remember him telling me a story. Excuse me. We were in Monte Carlo. I was there doing a story on him. And it's an interesting place for this story because obviously Monte Carlo is, I don't know if you ever competed there, but it's a place that's pretty rarefied air, and a lot of money there. And it's only the elite of the elite who's going to get the ability to live there. And he, as a tennis player, had that. And we were sitting there in this meeting room for an interview about his career. And he was describing a conversation he had with his father and his family when they were sitting around a table in Serbia during the war years when the country was breaking up and Serbia was kind of an international pariah. And he takes his hand and he goes, I remember my father holding a 20 Deutschmark bill in his hands and slamming it down on the table like that. And Novak slams his hand on the table and he goes, and my dad said, that's all we have left. So we're going to have to make do from this and find a way. And 20 Deutschmarks is probably, $15, $20. That's what they had in cash at the time as a family. And so looking at where he is now, he's earned hundreds of millions of dollars and made a lot out of his career. But that sort of point that has stuck with him all these years was a point of motivation. And I think a lot of athletes who make it big find those kind of key stages in their life when things are sort of pivotal that take them in a certain direction and create that extra hunger, extra drive that takes them over the top. And I'll never forget that sound of his hand hitting the table and him describing that, because it was sort of the sound that reverberated out from that was all the efforts and sacrifices that he'd made over time. I mean, it's not a funny story, but I think it's a very telling one in a lot of ways in terms of what
Yeah.
he's able to do.
No, that's extremely inspiring. And you do hear a lot of those stories, I guess you could say, from rags to riches. And you do have to have that extra drive. And it seems like for a lot of athletes, they're able to dig deep and find something deeper than themselves to push them to the highest level in sports. And so for him, that worked clearly. So what would you say, or what would you maybe give as advice to maybe some athletes who are struggling with some resources or maybe even motivation? I guess, yeah, what would you say if there's an athlete out there that's struggling to make it to the next step? Because you've spent a lot of time with the greats.
Well, I think ultimately adversity is important. I think you need it. I don't think that any path to the top is some kind of friction-free zone. It never is. So I suppose if you look at Novak's model, or a lot of the models over the years for some of the world soccer players, best soccer players in the world who come from very little. Look at track and field athletes like Bekele and people like that. I mean, very, very modest origins. They're able to create these amazing careers. But I think that the adversity and things that you're feeling can ultimately be fuel for you and also help you along the way. And I think it's not always the case. I mean, I know tennis players like Jessica Pegula, who's now in top 10 in the world, and she's a daughter of a billionaire. The guy who owns the Buffalo Bills, her dad and mom own the Bills and the Sabres, NHL. So you don't have to be from a tough background to make it in sports.
Right.
But I think if you do run into those sorts of obstacles, I think it's part of your story. And I think if you can find a way to get the advice that you need to create the skills that you have to have in a sport like tennis, if you don't learn the technique the right way, you're not going to make it. And I imagine in pole vaulting, which is what you did, if you don't have the right technique on the vaulting, you're not going to be able to make it. You have to have that part of it. But if you get that, the stuff that you run into, the headwinds that you have to face, I think ultimately make you stronger in a lot of ways. And in those moments when you're really on the line and you're pushing yourself to the ultimate level, if in a tennis match, it's like deep in a fifth set or deep in a long rally, or in a track and field competition, it's like in the last, 20, 30 meters of middle distance race or whatever it might be. 400 hurdles always the one I always think is the hardest one, right? But those sorts of things, that strength that you have in those moments comes from deep within. And a lot of athletes will tell you that they often almost surprise themselves by what they can find in those moments when they need it. But that comes from your life story. And I think it comes from how you've basically done the work all the way along your path. So rather than get frustrated, think of it as a chance to make yourself stronger. And I think a lot of athletes have figured that out along the way.
Yeah, and that also kind of makes me think. So I want to lead into, so you've spent some time in 2016, leading into the 2016 Olympics with Ashton Eaton and his wife, Brianne, in the multis events in track and field. So can you share with us maybe what you learned from your time with them, and also maybe some differences that you can see among sports, say in tennis, where there's a lot of money to be made versus track and field, maybe I guess maybe we can also talk about some of the differences in opportunities in sports.
Oh yeah. I mean, I gotta tell you, first of all, I just wish that someone like Ashton Eaton and Brienne, his wife, were better known around the world because what just terrific people they were and are. They're both retired now, but they gave me the opportunity to really spend a lot of time with them for the New York Times for the story. We spent, good chunks of time over a whole year watching them train in Santa Barbara and Oregon, up in Eugene, and then in Boston and overseas a little bit as well. And I got a chance to really get inside their process, getting ready to go to the Olympics in Rio with their coach, Harry Mara, who is a terrific guy as well, who has been a lifetime track and field coach, decathlete, decathlon and heptathlon coach. And I just felt like they were, I think, ultimately underappreciated by the American public. Ashton ends up winning a double gold medal in the decathlon. It's also changing tastes to some degree. Back in the 60s, back in the times of Bill Toomey and Rafer Johnson, things like that, he would have been a much bigger star in our culture. But obviously the team sports like the NFL and the NBA and things like that have taken over a lot of the air and space at the Olympics as well, with basketball players taking up so much of that air and space. But Ashton and Brienne, to get a chance to watch them day to day, just try to manage the schedule, manage the challenges, manage honing these different crafts. And as you know from track and field, I mean, the multis, you're trying to do basically the equivalent of rubbing your head and patting your tummy all the time. I mean, these are very different skills that you're having to figure out how to do. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
so it's kind of like a biathlon and winter sport where you're having to, do a long distance cross country race and then stop, calm yourself and shoot to a very narrow target. Decathlon and heptathlon are a little bit like that. You got to do all these different things, right? Your strength, explosion, precision, incredible technique with javelin, things like that are required. So I think in a way it was cool to watch how absorbing it was because you could never get everything just right. You had to kind of find a way to get good at everything at the same time. But just to watch their dedication, the level of micro thought that went into it, the quality people that they were, partly based on the fact that they had learned so much over the years from going into this micro process. And also, frankly, how much of it had to be self-driven because you were not getting a lot of positive feedback or feedback from the rest of the world. Getting some. I mean, Ashton was already a gold medalist, and Brienne had won a world medal in heptathlon at that point for Canada. But a lot of it was just driven day to day by this type of personality and this desire for perfection that was driving them. And I loved it. I mean, for me, just to be inside, like fly on the wall and listen to Harry Mara, their coach, talk to them about the details of this, all of this shining goal of the Olympics. And honestly, the way the world of sport has gone, that's a bit rarer now. I mean, when I first started following the Olympics, that was often the case. I mean, you would build up for 4 years for this one moment. And then over time, look at track and field, you started to have world championships every couple of years that also were a big deal. A lot of these one-day meets were big. You had a lot of other highlight moments, but the Olympics was not the end-all be-all anymore. But for Ashton and for Brienne, it still kind of was. They had the worlds, but the Olympics was really the whole thing. And so all that time, all that effort for this one moment in time, these 2 days for this event, and so much can go wrong, right? So it's that I found really interesting to watch the dynamic of how you handle the mental stress of that, of trying to build up to this one thing. Obviously, you get sick, your chances are ruined. You sprain an ankle at the wrong time, you pull a hammy, all these things. So just to kind of feel that pressure and then to see what happened. I mean, Brienne got the medal, and Ashton defended his title, but it was almost in a way more relief than it was joy. And also just the fact that he and Brienne had done it together, husband and wife, with Harry, their longtime coach. It was just a powerful thing to see from start to finish, and I really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate the time that they gave me.
Yeah, and I think that's just still to this day one of the things that you just have to appreciate about the Olympic Games is it is once every 4 years, and it's difficult to be on for that moment, and there is so much work that goes into it, but there's also a little bit of luck, like you said, you got to be healthy and just ready to go on that day. But it is nice that there are other opportunities to compete on the world stage outside of the Olympics. But I think in the eyes of the general public, I'm sure it's just still the most tuned into event for track and field, especially. And that really just is the biggest stage that you can be on in track and field. And so another thing I want to ask you about is you also covered Stacy Dragila, who was the first ever Olympic gold medalist in the women's pole vault. So talk to us a little bit about what it was like to be behind the scenes and get to know a trailblazer of the sport.
Yeah, I have a very good memory about that. Actually, I remember, I think the first time I saw Stacy was in Paris at the indoor world championships back in the 90s. I'm going to forget what year it was. I'm thinking maybe 99, because I think women's pole vault debuted at the Olympics in Sydney, right?
I think that's right.
In 2000. So I think it was the year before that, or it might even have been the same year in the wintertime before. But I just felt like I never really understood as a young person, why didn't women do the pole vault? They did everything else. Why did women run at the time? Why did they run 3,000 meters instead of 5? Why did they run 5 instead of 10? Why was running the marathon such a big thing? I mean, I guess I grew up in a house where that was just, equality was taken as a given. And so these things seemed illogical to me. Why in winter sport did women not do Nordic combined? Why did they not do ski jumping? So it just, to me, it was cool to see something that seemed illogical to me become logical. But then you watched it in person and you saw the incredible emotions that they were feeling, these athletes that were blazing this trail, and the level of reaction they were getting from the young girls in Paris, the young girls in Sydney, watching these women go out there and rock it in a obviously difficult, challenging discipline, and dangerous discipline as well. And I just remember also how very well spoken somebody like Stacy was, and what a great spokesperson she was, and how eager she was to play that role. But also, I mean, watching the pole vault, especially live, is great. I mean, it's spectacular, and I think the emotions that they generated and were feeling were all the more powerful because they were pioneers. And Stacy did a tough thing. I mean, she was the called shot for the gold, and she pulled it off, and that's tough to do in a technical sport where so much can go wrong. But I think I saw that again and again at the Olympics. Another time I saw it was with women's wrestling in Athens. Freestyle wrestling was also, a long time men's dominated sport, and to watch the first gold medals being given out to female wrestlers in Athens was really powerful as well. And I think it's also a sense of you're breaking barriers in the society, and you're creating a more equitable world. And the Olympics has a lot of faults. A lot of things are wrong with it. I think it's lost some momentum, maybe more in our country than other places to some degree, but it's still a beautiful vehicle for some great messages, and that's one of them for sure.
Yeah, and it's definitely come very far as women's sports, and it just kind of made me think what does make a sport grow in terms of popularity. And as you've spoken about your experience with all the players and athletes that you've interviewed and met, it really does come back to the stories and the emotions of it. And I think that's probably where your books are just so huge, and continuing to share that story, and that just creates the followers. What in your experience has created more of a following around a sport?
One thing I'd say too, is interesting that you mentioned that, because I feel like someone like Stacy Dragila, somebody like Michaela Schifrin now in women's skiing, who's broken all the records, somebody like Serena Williams, somebody like Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal. I feel like these people also grow because they are put in this situation where they have to speak publicly, speak to the sport, speak to the themes of what they're doing. And it's interesting to watch. I meet people in my job a lot of times early in their careers before they become who they become known as, and to see the personal growth of how they're able to handle these situations. I mean, Roger was like kind of a pimply, ill-groomed, sort of a rough-hewn kind of guy, Swiss teenager with dyed blonde hair, at one point. Everything from what he's known to be now. But you sort of see them, I'm not saying he changed in some false way, but he grew into his role as a spokesman for the sport. Somebody projects these values. Somebody like Stacy, I think I came very easily to her, but she was somebody who was able to take on that role. And she never got as big globally, obviously, as Roger Federer or Lionel Messi or somebody like that. But she, in her microcosm, became a rightfully big thing. I just think it's very cool to watch how these people grow in the spotlight. And I hope that the world of social media and people being able to protect themselves and pull themselves away from the public in some ways and just kind of create their own reality. Hope that doesn't go too far, because I think there's a lot of value in the give and take with journalists, with the public, with being out there and being able to speak to your sport in a very spontaneous and powerful way. But that's an aside. But I definitely have noticed that across all sports over time. So what was
Yeah.
your question? I missed what you said before.
Yeah, just kind of what you think helps grow the following of a sport, whether it's emotion or the stories that people learn, behind the scenes as far as what their life is like and what they've overcome. I think sharing those stories tied with the emotions that you see in the competition, in the match, in the game, really increases that following.
That's a great question. I never heard that question before. I think the fact of it is, let's look at it logically around the world. I mean, there's a big appeal to danger, to be honest with you, and to
Yeah,
that risk factor. I mean, that's not all sports that are globally popular are super risky, but there's this sort of desire for combat sports. And look at our country, National Football League. Yes, there's tradition. Yes, it anchors in communities. Yes, it's cool to watch with all the strategy, but ultimately there's this little frisson of danger to it, that pulls us in. Why is
yeah,
Formula One such a big thing around the world? Because there's that element of danger for the drivers and what could happen. There are other sports where that's less a factor, basketball, spectacular nature of it. I think it definitely helps most of the time if you're going to have a global sport with a lot of following, to have something that people can relate to and see and understand, and something that's widely practiced. I mean, soccer, having traveled around the world a lot, I mean, it's pretty much any place you go in the world, any back lot, any open stretch of grass or open stretch of dirt in Africa or wherever it is, people are playing some form of soccer. It's just the way it is.
it's
And
accessible.
yeah, and I think it's exactly, you don't need a lot of equipment. And so there's that connection to it on a very elemental level. I think the idea of, something simple like world's fastest man, world's fastest woman, everybody probably in their school or their neighborhood has raced someplace to see who's the fastest. Those sort of basic appeal things certainly help, but they don't explain the whole thing, because honestly, who's playing American football around the world? Not too many people, but yet it has a certain, I think, a very primal appeal to it, just like boxing or MMA and things like that. So that's, you can't discount that. And obviously rugby in other countries or Australian rules football. This is a kind of a human need that's being addressed through these sports. But then I think also it takes a long time, tradition, practice, people handing on love of a sport from generation to generation, mother to daughter, father to son. That's a big factor. I mean, when I lived in Spain for a long time, you could see on a very uncontroversial level the power of soccer translated across generations, and on a much more controversial level, the power of bullfighting passed on over time among people in southern Spain. And it's like, how could this still be popular? How could people still be watching this? Well, it was traditional. People didn't see that side of it when they were deep in the culture. They saw that it was part of the fabric of their society, and they passed it on generation to generation. So, I think it's a lot of factors, but, and the other factor probably too is it's got to be compelling and spectacular. And that also helps a lot. But ultimately, it needs to be anchored in the society in some real meaningful, durable way.
Yeah. Well, what lessons have you learned in sports that maybe you use in your everyday life?
That's a good one. Yeah, I think ultimately, and probably for all of us who've been involved as athletes at some level, and I was no great athlete by any means, but I have been a lifetime athlete. I still play racket sports and still do a lot of activity, and I loved it as a kid, and that's what drew me to it as a journalist. I think you get a lot of it by osmosis over time, right? I mean, you hear all these athletes talking about how they do it, why they do it, what they're doing, and you in your little minor key sporting life or your minor key life, you apply those lessons inevitably to your own way of being. And for sure, I think the idea that, okay, you're going through a period of difficulty. Um, how do you surmount that? How do you get through that? And you hear about athletes discussing that all the time, and ultimately it's, you don't, you don't stop trying, you bounce back from adversity, you show resilience. If it doesn't go well for you today, well, then you keep your eyes on what matters most to you, and you get up the next day and you try again. It's a very simple thing, but I think athletes, by the nature of what they do, it's part of the process inevitably. Otherwise, you just stop, right? There's no point. And I think in the everyday life, you don't get crowds cheering for you, or you don't have people when you're writing your book over your shoulder going, yeah, great paragraph, way to go, you're doing great. But you do have that sense as you're doing it that it's hard, and that the ultimate goal is to produce something of quality, just like it is, getting ready for an Olympics or getting ready for what you're trying to do. And I think ultimately that idea of micro effort creating a macro result is very helpful, and it's a very sporty kind of concept. And I remember somebody once said, you're feeling a little bit down, you're feeling like things aren't going your way. Well, industry is the antidote to melancholy. And I've always liked that. And I think that really applies. I mean, people can say, well, do you get motivated from success? Sure. But you also get motivated just from doing. When you decide what you want to do, maybe you're not feeling it, you get out there, you get in the process. And I've heard athletes say this before as well. From the process itself comes the motivation and comes the energy. So I think there's a lot to that. Routine and sticking to what you've committed to and following through, whether you're feeling great as you do it or not. A lot of value in that.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing is there's so many lessons to be learned in sports, and they really do translate to life. How many times do you prepare to do a workout that you may not want to do, but as soon as you start moving, you're okay. You're like, all right, I got this. And then it is that setting a goal and working towards that goal long term that really keeps you going, building the routine, building the habits. So then it's just second nature. Oh yeah, I wake up at 7 a.m. to do my lift, and then I go on about my day. It's all about building those habits.
Yeah, you're right. And the thing is, you asked about writing, which is what I know best. Ultimately, people always go, so how about writer's block? How'd you do it all those years? I never had time for writer's block. I mean, you get a daily deadline. You got to file your story. It's got to happen, whether you are feeling it like that day or not, whether you feel like you're maybe having a Hemingway day or you're not. I mean, you got to get the thing done.
That pressure kicks in and it's time to go.
Ultimately, you got a soccer game to play on a given night. If you're professional, unless you're injured, obviously, then you're going to go out and do it, and you got to go through it. So, I think ultimately, again, that's the power of routine, the power of habit, and also, you have the skill. There are going to be days you use it better than others, but you need to use it regularly, and you're going to, in that routine, you're going to find the strength. And ultimately, writing a book. I mean, the book I did on Federer ended up being close to 150,000 words, which is, it's a pretty good heave. That's about 400 plus pages. And it's the hardest thing I've ever done. But I think you have to enjoy the process and have to realize as you do it, if you can't just wait for inspiration. That's not going to work. You have to just find the inspiration in the doing. And I think, athletes get a lot more positive or negative feedback than the average person in life because of the nature of what they do. Although Ashton and Brianne Eaton were a little different because of the nature of what they were doing. But I think that's a really important thing for all of us to realize, is that it's the habit, the routine that creates the good result in the end.
Yeah, and doing hard things and overcoming different challenges really does create that confidence that you can continue to accomplish even more difficult things and overcome even more challenges. So I think that's just the beauty and in the grind, I guess you could say, in training for an athlete, because it's not always so glorious, like holding up the gold medal. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes, as you've seen. Now, one more question for you. Is there any player on your radar or any athlete that you're maybe looking to profile or write a next book about, or anyone that might interest you in that way?
I would love to tell you that. I can't really talk about
It's
that.
a secret.
Yeah, when time comes on, I'll be happy to talk about that. But I think I could tell you that there are other areas that interest me.
Yeah,
For
well,
sure.
maybe one
So, I mean,
area.
I think, I feel like I would love to do something more in the Olympic world. I mean, tennis is an Olympic sport, but I focus on that because that's where my audience has been. But I'd love to write something that's more an Olympic world and sort of the athletes that are pulled to that in some way. I've always been really interested in winter sports. I think something like sailing, which is in its kind of in-port mode, not so necessarily transcendent, but these guys who sail around the world nonstop, solo, in their own boat and manage all that. Amazing lessons in that. There was some good stuff written about that, and that's certainly an area that's always interested me. These people that go out there against the elements and and use their skills and race in that kind
Yeah.
of context. And I'm very interested as well in the global aspect of things, because that's ultimately what's kept me in it all these years. Is I think if I'd just been a U.S. sports writer writing about U.S. sports, that would have been fine. But I don't think I would have had the same passion for it day to day as I did, because being able to cover all these international sports, which aren't always getting, huge amount of coverage in the United States, stuff like figure skating, or stuff like Nordic skiing, stuff like sort of day-to-day track and field, those sorts of things. I just feel like the variety and the global nature of that is so cool, because you're writing about a runner from Ethiopia. Yeah, you're writing about running, but you're also writing about Ethiopia.
Yeah.
You're writing about Haile Gebrselassie and the role he plays in that society in Ethiopia as a great runner, and what that brings to that society. Why did he get venerated there and not somewhere else? I mean, all these things knock on. So I'm definitely interested as a writer in exploring more and more of that kind of global aspect of sport, and the way it resonates around the world.
Yeah, I'd be interested. And sailing really isn't something that I follow that much or hear much about, but I think that would be really interesting just to dive in and learn a little bit more about that. Well, Chris, where might our listeners be able to learn more about you or find you, or maybe even find your books?
Well, thanks for asking. I'd love anybody who's interested in tennis in particular, if they want to follow along. Tennis and Beyond on Substack is like I said, partially open, free, partially subscription. And it's going to be one of my main vehicles day to day going forward for the next few years. It's very focused on tennis, but I'll branch out some and write about bigger themes. And then the book on Nadal, called The Warrior, is going to be coming out in 2025. He's still playing. He's coming back, I think, for the clay court season. Looks like this probably will be his final season of competitive tennis. And he's a dad now, and he's been fighting his body for a long time, but I think he wants to go out on his favorite surface of red clay in Paris one more time. And the Olympics, as you know, are in Paris this year coming up. And the Olympic tennis tournament will be played at Roland Garros Stadium in Paris on red clay in August. So I think it's something he wants to check off on his list before he gallops off into the Majorcan sunset where he's from. But yes, that's the two main things where I'm writing. And also I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram. So if anybody wants to contact me, feel free to reach out through those forums.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And we'll certainly be following you and would love to check out your books. So we wish you the best. And yeah, we'll just keep following you and any other stories that might pop up. I can't wait to see who that next player is going to be about.
I appreciate that. No, it's a pleasure, and I wish you well, and all my respect for being a competitive pole vaulter. That's a tough way to do it, but it's a great challenge day to day, I'm sure.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's fun, but it's worth it. Hey guys, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. If you liked this episode, then please go ahead, subscribe, like, or comment. This helps us grow more than you know, so we can keep making more content like this.
Or you can visit us on sportfuelslife.com and register to become a member for free, so you never miss another podcast episode. Thanks for listening.
Do it, you won't regret it.